The first time someone told you the story of Cain and Abel? You were probably a kid, maybe sitting in a Sunday school classroom, maybe looking at one of those brightly colored children's Bibles with the little illustrations, and they told you this story about two brothers, a farmer and a shepherd. They both bring offerings to God. God likes one and rejects the other. For no reason anybody bothered to explain. Just one yes, one no. And then one brother kills the other. Right there in a field. The first murder in human history. And then God curses the killer. And then, and this is the part that nobody ever slows down on, God protects him. You probably let that go. You were a child. You believed the adults who told you they were speaking for God. Well, then the story got filed away somewhere in the back of your mind as a simple morality tale about jealousy. But here's what they never told you. That story, the one you learned as a child, the one you were never supposed to question, contains a plot hole so enormous, so mathematically visible, so logically absurd, that the people who wrote it accidentally left proof inside the text that they were borrowing from an older story. A story that existed at least 1,000 years before Genesis was written. And when you find that proof, when you actually see it with your own eyes, the entire architecture of what this story was designed to do to you becomes impossible to ignore. And I mean that literally, impossible. So let's go right to it. Let's open Genesis chapter 4 and run the math. Such because the math is where this thing falls apart first. And I mean, it falls apart fast. According to the strict, literal reading of Genesis, the only reading most of us were ever given, God creates Adam and Eve, the first and only humans on earth. Two people, then they have two sons, Cain, a farmer, Abel, a shepherd. That is 4 human beings on the entire planet. 4. Cain kills Abel. 3. God confronts Cain, pronounces the curse, fugitive, wanderer, driven from the land forever. And now, listen very carefully to what Cain says back. This is Genesis 4, verse 14. Word for word. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Stop. Whoever finds me will kill me. Who is whoever? I mean, just sit with that for a second. Really, sit with it. There are 3 people alive on earth. His mother, his father, and him. Is he afraid Eve is going to form a search party? Is he worried Adam is going to track him across the desert with a torch? Because the word whoever, that word doesn't describe a family of 2 elderly people. That word implies a world full of strangers, other tribes, other settlements, people who might encounter a wandering fugitive and decide to attack him. And look at how God responds. God doesn't say, Cain, relax, there's nobody out there, it's just your parents. No. God validates the fear completely. Verse 15, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him 7-fold. And then God puts a physical mark on Cain specifically to warn off a population of people that, yet according to this exact same book, does not yet exist. God is protecting Cain from people the story forgot to create. Now, I've asked pastors about this. You've probably thought about it too, maybe even tried to ask. And the standard answer, the one you almost always get, goes something like, well, Adam and Eve had dozens of unnamed children. Over 100 years or so, they populated the surrounding areas. That's who Cain was afraid of. But the text doesn't say that. It just doesn't. The text introduces Adam's 3rd son, Seth, explicitly as a replacement for Abel. The entire narrative treats Cain and Abel as the only children at the time of the murder. There are no unnamed dozens anywhere near this moment in the story. What you're actually looking at is a seam, an editorial collision, two different source stories, stitched together by scribes who didn't clean up the join carefully enough. And they left the evidence of that surgery right there on the page, in plain sight, for anyone willing to look. And that first crack, that's just the beginning. Before I show you the other 6, and some of them are significantly more disturbing than this one, I want to tell you about a man who found exactly the same thing you just found. Not recently, almost 400 years ago. His name was Baruch Spinoza. He was 23 years old, living in Amsterdam, raised inside a tight-knit Portuguese Jewish community. Brilliant, deeply educated in Torah and Talmud, and he had been quietly noticing things in the text. Things that didn't line up. Geographical references that belonged to centuries after Moses supposedly lived. Timelines that contradicted each other. Passages that read like they were written by people describing events they couldn't possibly have witnessed firsthand. And he had the audacity, the absolute audacity, to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the Bible should be read the way you'd read any other ancient book, as a human document, subject to human error, because the evidence inside it points directly to human authorship. In July of 1656, the elders of his synagogue issued a formal document against him, the Cherem, the most brutal excommunication ever recorded by his community. And listen to the actual language of it. This is a direct quote. "Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. They commanded that no one speak to him, and no one do business with him. No one read a single word he wrote. No one stand within 6 feet of his body. His own family, was told to mourn him as though he had already died. He was 23 years old. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to every time I think about this. They didn't curse him for what he published. He hadn't published anything yet. They cursed him for the direction his thinking was going, for the questions he was asking privately, in conversation, quietly. Because some questions, even before they become arguments, even before they become books, are too dangerous to let exist inside an institution that depends on you not asking them. Does that feeling sound familiar? That knot in your stomach when you hit a verse that made no sense? Does that voice that said, "This doesn't add up," and then the other voice, the louder one, that said, "You weren't supposed to think that"? That's not a spiritual failing. That's the same exact thing Spinoza felt. And they destroyed his entire life for feeling it. Drop your city or your country in the comments right now. Let's see where everyone is watching from today. Let's build a map of people who are finally done, being told that the knot in their stomach is a sin. All right, back to Genesis. Because that first impossibility, the phantom population, the whoever, is just the setup for what comes immediately after it. And what comes after it is, honestly, one of the most uncomfortable things you will ever hear a religious institution try to defend with a straight face. The wife, Genesis 4, verse 16. Now Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, his wife. We are, by the text's own account, looking at a world with 3 living people, Cain walks into a new territory, and he has a wife. Where did she come from? Now, think about the two possible answers here, because both of them are devastating, just in completely different directions. Option 1. She was already living in the land of Nod. Cain walked into a populated region and found a woman who was already there. If that's true, if that's actually what happened, then God created other human beings outside the Garden of Eden. People who had nothing to do with Adam. People who were never part of that bloodline. And if that's true, the entire doctrine of original sin just collapses, because you cannot pass a biological inheritance through a bloodline to people who were never in that bloodline to begin with. The whole theological framework, sin entering the world through one man, spreading to every human being in history, gone. Destroyed by an unnamed woman in the land of Nod, whose origin the text doesn't even try to explain. The church cannot accept that. So they give you option 2. And I want you to hear this stated plainly, without the theological packaging, without the careful wording designed to make it sound less like what it is. They tell you Cain married his sister. To defend the literal inerrancy of Genesis, theologians will look you in the eye and tell you, seriously, with a straight face, that the human race propagated through direct first-generation sibling
If you mash strawberries and layer it between peanut butter and chocolate, then freeze
incest. They dress it up. Said, of course. The gene pool was pure back then, closer to creation, so there was no genetic damage. Or, and I mean, this one really is something, God hadn't officially prohibited incest yet, so it wasn't technically a sin at that point in history. I want you to really sit with what that means. The institution that has lectured you on sexual purity your entire life. The institution that claims to hold the absolute, eternal, unchanging moral standard of the universe. That institution, that same one, is defending brother-sister incest to keep their timeline intact. They will tell you incest is an abomination, an act God finds detestable, a moral absolute. Unless, of course, God needed it to get humanity started, in which case he apparently designed the system that required it, and it was completely fine, no problem. Let's move on. I mean, that's not theology. That's a retroactive rationalization to cover a broken story. And what makes it worse, what really makes it worse, is that they know the wife appears from nowhere. They know the plot hole is there, and faced with a choice between admitting that a human scribe made a human error or defending incest, they chose incest. Not once, not twice. Every single time someone presses them on this, that's the answer they land on. Every time. Spinoza would have recognized this pattern without blinking. The institution will always, always choose the explanation that protects the authority of the text over the explanation that requires intellectual honesty. Because admitting one scribal error means admitting the text is human. And if the text is human, the entire authority built on top of it starts to crack. Now, I'd read the second half of that same verse, because the same sentence that gives us the impossible wife gives us something even more logically absurd. And I say that knowing how absurd the wife situation already is. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son. Cain built a city. Let's just think about what that actually means. Not symbolically, physically, practically. Like, what does it actually take to build a city? A city, even in the ancient Bronze Age, is not a shelter. It's not a tent. It's not a log cabin someone throws together in a weekend. A city is a concentrated human settlement requiring massive coordinated labor. You need people cutting stone or baking mud bricks. You need people constructing walls. And walls, by definition, only exist to keep other people out, which already implies a world full of other people. And while those people are building walls, they can't be farming, which means you need a completely separate agricultural workforce producing enough food surplus to feed the builders while they work. And then you need an actual population to fill the city once it exists. Otherwise, it's not a city. It's just an empty structure sitting in a desert with nobody in it. The text is asking you to believe that a cursed, wandering fugitive, his nameless wife, and a newborn baby built a city. 3 people. One of them in diapers. This is not a theological mystery. It's not a matter of faith or interpretation. It's a violation of basic physics and logistics. You cannot build a city with a workforce of 1 man. And you have absolutely no reason to build defensive walls if there is genuinely nobody else on earth. So why is it in the text? Because scholars have known for over a century that the story of Cain is what anthropologists call an etiology, an origin myth, not a historical record, a story designed to explain where things came from. The ancient Hebrews wanted to explain the origin of urban settlements, of music, of metalworking. So they built a genealogy of firsts. Cain builds the first city. His descendant Jubal is the first musician. Tubal-Cain, and that name is not a coincidence, the first metalworker. The author is cataloging the emergence of human civilization in mythological shorthand. As literature, as cultural mythology, it's actually doing something real and meaningful. But when you force it to be literal, not factual history, as the church forces you to read it, you end up with 1 man laying bricks for a ghost town completely alone in a desert, building defensive walls to protect himself from people who, by the book's own account, don't exist yet. It's a fairy tale, and you were made to feel guilty for noticing that. Now, we get to the truth that I think is the most morally uncomfortable of all 7, because this one isn't just a logical problem. This one is a problem with the actual character of the God you were taught to worship. And I want to say that carefully, not to be provocative, but because it's what the text itself shows when you read it honestly. Why did Cain kill Abel? Jealousy. That's the Sunday school answer. But ask the next question. Just ask it. Where did the jealousy come from? It came from God. On Genesis says Cain brought fruit from the ground. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock. God accepts Abel's offering, rejects Cain's. No explanation. None. Not a single word of justification. And I know what you've heard in church about this. Because I've heard every version of it too. Abel gave his best. Cain just grabbed whatever was lying around. Abel offered blood, and blood is what God requires for the forgiveness of sin. Cain's heart just wasn't in the right place. Go open your Bible right now. Open Genesis chapter 4. Look for those explanations. They aren't there. The text never says Cain gave leftovers. It says he brought fruit of the ground, which is precisely what a farmer would bring. That's his livelihood. That's what he has. That's what he grows. But the text never says God demanded blood at this point in the narrative. And here's the thing. When God finally does outline the rules for offerings in the book of Leviticus, thousands of years later in the biblical timeline, grain offerings are explicitly listed as completely acceptable. There's an entire dedicated section for them. Grain offerings from farmers like Cain. Cain was a farmer. He brought what he grew. Abel was a shepherd. He brought what he raised. By every standard the biblical text itself later establishes, both were valid offerings. And God, with no prior warning, no stated criteria, no explanation whatsoever, rejects one and accepts the other. And then, and this is the part that really gets me every time, when Cain reacts with visible anger, God comes to him and says, "Why are you angry? If you do well, won't you be accepted?" How? How was Cain supposed to know what doing well looked like if nobody told him the rules? How do you fail a test nobody told you was happening? This is a pattern most of us recognize from somewhere much closer to home than ancient theology. Set invisible rules. Play favorites. Then blame the person who reacts to the injustice. God engineers the exact conditions that create the jealousy, fails to communicate the standard that would have prevented the anger, watches as the inevitable unfolds, and then turns to the person who was failed and asks, "Why are you so angry?" And here is where Spinoza's way of reading becomes genuinely invaluable. Why would the authors write God this way? Why would you write your own God as arbitrary and cruel? Because the authors were priests, and the priestly class in Jerusalem built their entire economy around animal sacrifice. The temple was, it was essentially a massive institutionally managed slaughterhouse, and a highly profitable one, that required a constant flow of livestock. They needed a founding myth, a story that established, from literally the first generation of human existence, from the very first offerings ever made on earth, that God prefers the shepherd's blood sacrifice over the farmer's grain. They weren't recording divine revelation. They were writing institutional propaganda. And to do it, they made God look arbitrary and cruel. They made God the direct instigator of the first murder in human history. And then they spent the next 3,000 years writing sermons about his perfect justice. And what bothered Spinoza most about this wasn't just the logical inconsistency. It was what the institution did with it afterwards. Because you read that story, you read a God who played favorites and punished someone for reacting to unfairness. And instead of being allowed to say, "That seems unjust," you were told that if it seems wrong to you, that's your fallen nature talking, your limited human understanding failing to grasp the infinite ways of the divine. The text made God capricious. The institution made your sense of justice the problem. Hold on to that, because the next truth is where you find out that none of this was even original to begin with, not one word of it. This is the one that seminary professors and biblical archaeologists have quietly known about for over 100 years, and the one that is completely undisputed in academic circles, and the one your pastor will almost certainly never mention from the pulpit. Long before the Hebrew people existed as a distinct nation, we're talking at least 1,000 years, probably more, before the earliest layers of Genesis were written. The civilizations of Mesopotamia were telling a very specific kind of story. Scholars call them disputation myths, ancient literary contests where two characters representing two different ways of life compete for divine favor. One of the most famous Sumerian texts, dating to roughly 2000 BCE, involves two figures, Dumuzi and Enkidu. Dumuzi is the shepherd god. Enkidu is the farmer god. They both seek the favor of the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven. Dumuzi brings animals, milk, soft wool, the products of the flock. Enkidu brings grain, barley, flax, the products of the earth. Each argues that his offering is superior. The deity chooses one. The other is filled with resentment and rivalry. A shepherd and a farmer. Competing offerings, a deity choosing one over the other, the rejected one consumed by rage. This story was already ancient when the scribes who wrote Genesis were born. Now, the details differ. In the Sumerian version, Inanna actually prefers the farmer at first, and the shepherd has to argue his way to victory. The Hebrew writers reversed that preference. They needed the animal sacrifice to win, because their priestly economy depended on it. But the structure, shepherd versus farmer, competing offerings, divine preference given to one, the other filled with resentment. That structure is not a coincidence, and it cannot be a coincidence. The parallel is exact. The cuneiform tablets exist. The translations exist. The peer-reviewed scholarship on this has been published for over a century in universities across the world. The authors of Genesis did not receive a divine revelation about two literal brothers at the beginning of time. They took a pre-existing, widely known Mesopotamian literary framework, stripped out the polytheism, replaced the goddess with Yahweh, reversed the preference to serve their theological agenda, added a murder to establish the doctrine of sin. They copied the homework, changed the names, added a body, and told you it was the Word of God. Spinoza was the first major Western thinker to say this publicly, systematically, and without apology. That's not because nobody had noticed before. Scholars had been quietly discussing these borrowings for generations. But he was the first to say it plainly in a published work, without hedging. The Bible reflects the cultural context, the literary conventions, the political interests, and the human limitations of the people who wrote it. And once you understand that, once you really understand that, the institution's claim to absolute authority over your life loses its foundation. They called his published work a book forged in hell. The Catholic Church put it on the index of prohibited books within the decade. Protestant authorities across Europe condemned it. They did everything they could to make sure you never encountered his method of reading. Because his method was just this: follow the logic. Read what's actually there, and go wherever the evidence points, without flinching, without asking permission first. Now, the sixth truth is where this stops being a historical discussion and becomes something personally, viscerally dangerous. Because this one isn't about a plot hole or a borrowed myth. This one is about what happens when institutions take these myths literally and hand them to people with power over other people's lives. Genesis 4:15. God puts a mark on Cain to protect him from being killed. What was the mark? For centuries, and I want to be clear, this was not a fringe view. This was mainstream church teaching. Prominent theologians and religious leaders taught that the mark of Cain was dark skin. During the era of the transatlantic slave trade and well into the 19th and 20th centuries, this verse was actively, explicitly used to construct a theological justification for chattel slavery. People of African descent were taught, from pulpits, in Sunday schools, in official denominational doctrine, that they were the cursed bloodline of the first murderer, divinely marked by God himself to live as outcasts and servants. They used a plot hole in a borrowed Sumerian myth, a myth we've already shown is logically broken, editorially stitched, and not historically original, to put chains on millions of human beings. And they said God told them to. So what does the mark actually mean? Not as theology, but as history, as linguistics, as anthropology. Look at the name Cain. In Hebrew, Cain. And Cain is the direct linguistic root of the word Canite. The Cainites were a real, documented, historically attested tribe. The nomadic metalworkers, itinerant smiths, the Britannica calls them, who traveled through the desert regions surrounding ancient Israel. What do we know about them from historical sources? They wandered. They didn't settle in fertile agricultural land. They had a fierce tribal code of blood vengeance. Harm one of us, and 7 of yours will answer for it. And like many ancient desert peoples, they used ritual body markings to identify themselves to strangers and to signal clearly that attacking them would be extremely costly. Now read that list again and compare it to Genesis 4. Wandering on the earth, driven from the fertile ground, a mark on them, vengeance 7-fold. That is not the biography of one individual man at the literal dawn of creation. That is a real-time description of the Cainites as the Israelite scribes observed them living right next door. The story of Cain is a just-so story, an etiology invented to explain a neighboring tribe that the Israelites could literally see with their own eyes. The scribes looked at the Cainites, saw their wandering, their markings, their blood codes, and invented an ancestor to explain all of it. Their ancestor must have done something terrible, they said. And God cursed that bloodline to wander forever and marked them so everyone would know it. As anthropology, it is genuinely fascinating. As literal divine history, as the Church demands you read it, it is one of the most dangerous things ever committed to writing. Because when you take a myth designed to explain a tribe's cultural practices and elevate it to the status of permanent, God-ordained curse on a people, you have built a machine for manufacturing oppression. You have handed any institution with power a divine warrant to point at any group of human beings, call them marked by God, and let history take care of the rest. Spinoza's most urgent warning, the warning that made him the most hunted philosopher in Europe, was exactly this. When you hand human writings the authority of divine perfection, you hand the men who control those writings unlimited power to use God as the justification for whatever they want to do to other people. The history of the mark of Cain is not an aberration. It is not a misuse of Scripture by a few bad people. It is the logical, predictable, inevitable endpoint of that kind of unquestioned authority over a text. And that takes us directly to the 7th truth, the last one. And honestly, the one I want you to carry with you after this video ends. Because this one isn't about a plot hole. It isn't about a borrowed myth. It isn't even about a historical atrocity, as devastating as that was. This one is about you, right now. The way you think about yourself when nobody else is in the room. Why is the story of Cain and Abel the very next event after Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden? Think about the structure deliberately. Don't just read it. Think about why it was built this way. Adam and Eve commit the first sin. What is it? They eat fruit they weren't supposed to eat. That's it. It's an act of disobedience. It's not violent. It's not predatory. Oh, in the context of a parent and a child, honestly, it's almost understandable. You tell someone not to touch something, and curiosity wins. That happens. But the institution needs you to believe something much, much larger than one act of disobedience. They need you to believe in total depravity. The doctrine that the fall didn't just introduce a flaw into human nature, it corrupted human nature completely, irreparably, beyond your own ability to manage. They need you to believe that without religious authority standing between you and your own impulses at all times, you are fundamentally, inherently, incurably dangerous. And one act of eating forbidden fruit doesn't quite get you there. So, what is the very next thing they place in the timeline? Immediately after, with no gap, no generation of peace, no chance to breathe, murder. fratricide, the most intimate possible violence, a brother killing a brother in a field, the complete, total, irreversible collapse of human morality in exactly one generation. That sequencing is not accidental. It's not just how the story happened to go. It is a deliberate narrative decision. It is architectural. It is designed to communicate a specific message before you even realize a message is being communicated to you. And the message is this: look how fast you destroy things. Your parents disobeyed this morning. By tomorrow you are killing each other in the dirt. You have violence in your blood. You are born jealous. You are born with rage crouching at the door, waiting for the right moment. You cannot trust your own heart. You cannot govern your own impulses. You are not safe without us. And what I need you to notice, really notice, is how that message doesn't stay inside the story. It doesn't stay in ancient history. It follows you out of the building and into your ordinary daily life. Because it doesn't get delivered just as theology. It gets delivered as personal psychology, as a description of your interior life specifically. When you feel normal human envy, the kind every social creature feels, the kind that is literally wired into us because it helped our ancestors navigate group hierarchies for hundreds of thousands of years.
Remember your ABCs! Always be clogging! And the Walmart app has over 500 million items.
Walmart has dancing shoes?
Who knew? Who knew?
The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
They tell you that is the spirit of Cain rising up inside you. When you feel anger, normal, human, proportionate anger, they quote God's warning to the first murderer. Sin is crouching at your door, just like it was for Cain. When you feel jealousy, ambition, resentment, a desire, all the completely ordinary textures of a human interior life, they have a story ready, a specific story. That maps your feeling directly onto the psychology of the first killer in recorded history. They took a Bronze Age political myth about a nomadic tribe, borrowed it wholesale from Sumerian folklore, filled it with editorial seams and logical impossibilities, stitched it imperfectly into an origin story it was never designed to carry, and then installed it inside your private psychology as a description of who you are by default. Without their guidance, without their intervention, without their authority over your life. That doubt you felt, that confusion, and that knot in your stomach when you read a verse that didn't add up, and that voice that said, "This doesn't make sense," and the louder voice that said you weren't supposed to think that. They told you the second voice was God. They told you the first voice, the one asking honest questions, was the enemy inside you, the fallen nature asserting itself. They had it exactly backwards. Spinoza spent his entire adult life, exiled, formally cursed, banned across a continent, grinding lenses to pay his rent, writing at night in a room he couldn't leave freely, arguing against exactly this, not against God, not against spiritual experience, against the specific, calculated use of ancient texts to make people afraid of their own minds. He understood, clearly, and at enormous personal cost, that an institution which needs you to believe you are fundamentally broken is an institution that needs to sell you the cure. And the cure is always the same thing: obedience, compliance, silence. They cursed him by day and by night. They wanted him erased from memory, because the thing he was handing people, the simple, radical, almost embarrassingly obvious permission to read, to question, to follow logic wherever it leads without asking for institutional approval first. That permission is the one thing that kind of authority cannot survive. You have that permission. You've always had it. Look at what we just walked through together. The phantom population, the whoever that appeared out of nowhere and required 100 years of unnamed, unmentioned children to explain away. The impossible wife who either destroys the entire doctrine of original sin or forces the church to defend incest. And they chose incest every single time. The city that 3 people, one of them a newborn, could not have built by any law of physics, logistics, or basic common sense. The offering rejected by a God who never stated the rules, who created the jealousy and then condemned the jealousy, written that way by priests protecting a sacrificial economy worth a fortune. The Sumerian source material, 1,000 years older than Genesis, with the same shepherd, the same farmer, the same competing offerings, the same divine rejection, the same resulting rage. The tribal mark ripped from its anthropological context and used as a divine warrant for slavery. And the deliberate and architectural placement of fratricide immediately after the fall. Not because that's how history happened, but because that is the most efficient possible sequence for convincing you that you are broken by default and require constant management. Every single one of those things is in the text. Not hidden, not buried in academic footnotes, right there on the page, in plain sight, waiting for anyone willing to read without the filter of institutional fear. The church knows this. Seminaries teach versions of this. Biblical scholars publish papers on this every single year. This is not secret knowledge, but it was kept from you, deliberately.
Get cooking without excuses.
Specifically from you. Just because if you understood that this story is ancient borrowed literature with human fingerprints all over it, then the doctrine of total depravity built on top of it loses its claim on your life. It stops being a fact about your nature and becomes an argument someone made from a flawed and borrowed text to keep you manageable, to keep you sitting in that pew, carrying that guilt, paying that tithe, and begging forgiveness for the crime of simply being human. You are allowed to put this story down. Not with bitterness, not because the years were wasted. They weren't. You were doing exactly what you could with what you were given. But you can look at it now for what the evidence actually shows it to be. An ancient, layered, borrowed, humanly edited piece of literature. Genuinely fascinating, culturally significant, full of meaning when read honestly, without the demand that it be something it isn't. And completely without authority over your moral worth. You do not have to carry the guilt of a fall the archaeology doesn't support. You do not have to accept that violence is your default setting because a nomadic tribe's origin myth, borrowed from Sumerian folklore and imperfectly edited by priests with an economic agenda, says so. You are not Cain. You were never Cain. You were never the thing they needed you to believe you were in order to need them. The doubt you felt, sitting in that room, reading that verse, feeling that knot, that was not the enemy inside you. That was the most reliable thing about you. The part that refuses to be lied to. The part that Spinoza, alone in his exile, cursed by name, ungrinding lenses in a room he couldn't leave freely, spent his whole life trying to protect. Tell me in the comments which of these 7 truths hit you the hardest. Was it the Sumerian myth? The moment you realized they copied the homework? Was it the one-man city? Was it the arbitrary rejection, a God who set invisible rules and then blamed the person who failed them? I read every single comment, because the specific crack that opens it for people tells me everything about what we still need to keep talking about. And if this gave you even a moment of relief, if it put words to something you have been carrying quietly for years, maybe decades, don't keep it to yourself. The algorithm does not favor this kind of content. It just doesn't. The only way it reaches the people who need it is if you send it to them directly. And the friend who walked away but still wakes up feeling guilty. The family member who started asking questions and doesn't know what to do with them. Send it to them. That's how this spreads. The story of Cain and Abel was designed to make you afraid of the dark inside yourself. The only dark in this story is the shadow cast by the men who needed you to believe it. Next time, we are going to look at a story so universally loved, so deeply embedded in our culture, that questioning it feels almost like a crime. We are going to look at Noah's flood. And we are going to do the math. Subscribe, because you won't want to miss what happens when the water starts rising.